Hi, I'm Yulia, and this is Burning Questions. The topic that set the internet on fire this week is what is happening in Ukraine and why are Ukrainians protesting? So let's dissect it and find answers to these questions with operator Starsky.
Hello, my friends. Always a pleasure to be in the studio. I'm operator Starsky, also known as Andrew Coolish. I am one of the colleagues of Yulia, working at the UATV channel. I'm also a veteran, former policeman, former National Guardsman of the National Guard of Ukraine, and basically a YouTuber, a talking head on the screen.
A talking head is always a very funny way to introduce yourself, but yes, you do have an impressive track record of government-related work. So, speaking of the government and government-related work, I'm sure that the hottest topic on the internet this week is the fact that there are massive protests erupting in Ukraine. And obviously, we have seen propaganda having not even a field day with it, but a field week. They're having such a fun time. Marjorie Taylor Greene posting on her Twitter that Ukrainians are protesting for peace talks and against fighting in the war was like the cherry on top of the cake. So our government passed law, what is it, 12414. Do you want to explain to our viewers what that law is?
Basically, this law places two anti-corruption agencies in Ukraine. We're talking about the National Anti-Corruption Bureau and Specialized Prosecutor Office under the supervision of General Prosecutor of Ukraine, which is basically wrong because those agencies were supposed to be independent. They were not supposed to be supervised by any higher agency, and the reason they emerged was basically due to the reforms of 2014, 2015, reforms of the law enforcement in Ukraine, and this massive fight against corruption that was waged in Ukraine since 2014. And the way this law was, the way this bill was passed, basically this raised a lot of protests in the Ukrainian society because people are concerned that this might put all this struggle against corruption in a very, very bad position. Those agencies must be independent. When you have a single agency that is responsible for fighting corruption, there's always a risk because what if we have cases of corruption in this agency, what to do next. Until 2014, there were such concerns about Security Service of Ukraine, for example, right? And we remember that after the Russian full-scale invasion, 2022, there was a massive clearing of Security Service of Ukraine with multiple cases exposed of corruption and Russian moles, basically Russian spies working in that agency. And until 2014, basically, Security Service of Ukraine had those privileges, right? Those functions of fighting corruption, arresting high officials, right? Top officials and things like that. So, National Anti-Corruption Bureau and Specialized Prosecutor Office they were basically created in order to be independent agencies that would not be controlled by other entities, by other authorities, and would be able to arrest top officials that did bad things, right? That did corruption and things like that. So we can see clearly that at this very moment, Russia is enjoying whatever is happening right now very much, trying to present this as people fighting against the Kyiv regime, Kyiv junta, and things like that, which in reality is like in an absolute nonsense. You can see the banners the people are standing with outside on the streets saying that this law is crap.
Yeah.
This bill is crap. Not a single word about changing government or changing president or whatever. Yeah, but If you want to ask me how I see this situation, whether it's a fail or win, to me, it's a win, 100%. And I will explain you why. First of all, we have quite a few concerns about Russian spies and Russian influences in those anti-corruption agencies, right?
Yeah.
Which is something that we should fight against. On the other hand, we see attempts from the coming from the presidential office of dealing with those threats. We have General Prosecutor of Ukraine, Mr. Ruslan Kravchenko, who is basically very well known for fighting against corruption and against Russian influences. He's on the wanted list in Russia. He already issued multiple warrants against Russian war criminals, so we know about that. On the other hand, we have plenty of people outside active Ukrainian society who went on the streets being concerned about those anti-corruption agencies losing their independence, which is again great. What I can see here is basically the process that started, that is ongoing, and it's a good process because in all those three cases, we have positive results. The only negative thing that we can see here is basically miscommunication. As someone who worked in the law enforcement for quite a while, I can tell you that in 99% all sorts of trouble between society and between our establishments, they come because they emerge because of miscommunication. And that's basically it.
Well, I do agree that it was very bad communication, and I do applaud the fact that once the people started coming to the streets, we did see democracy in action in a sense that Zelensky came out and said, okay, listen, like we hear you, we see all of your like posts on social media, we're going to have an emergency meeting next week, and we're going to introduce a new law that's different, and we're going to vote on it. So I was at the protests, and so were most of the journalists that I know in Ukraine. In fact, this is probably the place where I've seen most of the people I haven't seen in a very long time. It was almost like every single friend I've been planning lunch with and not having time to see was at that protest. I like run into absolutely everybody I knew. But so I have two issues with this law, right? That I don't even think were not communicated well, but were not solved well, because I do agree that we have a lot of issues with NABU and SAP, and that they need to be fixed. But the problem is that these bureaus also investigate corruption in higher institutions like higher government, and they cannot be subservient to the higher government while they're investigating the higher government, because that's just, it's a conflict of interest, and that's a problem. These bureaus do have to stay independent. They can have the Prosecutor General at their disposal, and they can work with the Prosecutor General, but they cannot be dependent from the Prosecutor General, because while I'm not necessarily super worried about Zelensky's administration abusing this power, but I am worried about other administrations coming in and abusing this power. So it's not necessarily something I'm comfortable leaving as is. And then there are a lot of like little things in this law that are just absolutely insane. Like for instance, SBU no longer needs a warrant for a search warrant to enter someone's property if they suspect them of ties with Russia or corruption. And I understand what they mean by that, because normally when you submit for a search warrant, someone sees it in the system, warns the person who is participating in the corruption, they take all of the stuff that's in their house, move it somewhere else, then there is a search, and nothing is found on the spot, and that's how they get away with it. I get it. But there also need to be legal processes involved in that, because in that case, you're giving SBU absolutely unhinged power to enter anyone's apartment or anyone's premises if they believe that there is something going on. So it's like, I understand that they're doing this situationally and because we do have a need for that, right? But that could be so easily abused come future. So there are lots of like little things in this law and in this bill and with this whole situation that I just think are absolutely not okay. Like when I see people talking about being a dictatorship and all of this stuff, I disagree with it. I don't think it was made with that in mind to like, backtrack like human rights. And I think that a lot of people believe that it was done so corruption can go unpunished. I think that the problem was miscommunication, and it came out of the left field. Nothing was explained to people. No cases of actual, corruption and Russian ties and like names were named. They were just like, okay, we're making these institutions no longer independent, and we're putting all of these stupid provisions that basically take away your safety and human rights into this law, and you just have to deal with it. And provided that the creation of these agencies and them being independent is also one of the biggest parts of the legacy of Maidan, I think that people just felt stabbed in the back. And I do believe that in order for people to get what they now want, is the communication has to be top notch. Like they have to provide a plan, they have to show all of their sort of like all of the steps of how they're going to make these agencies more efficient. And I do think that the non-independence needs to be scrapped because it's just counterproductive.
100%, I agree with you. And by the way, people felt stabbed in the back already after creation of those agencies, because the expectations in the Ukrainian society were that immediately all of Yanukovych era officials, all those corrupted politicians and authorities will be arrested, all the shooters that were shooting the protesters at the Maidan will be prosecuted and things like that. And until this day, we cannot see much results coming from those agencies, which on one hand, of course, I can understand, because if you're investigating cases of corruption against a person who knows that you're investigating those cases against them, then of course it's very, very hard. It makes it harder tenfold. I would not be really worried about our government, okay? Our government, let's say if there are attempts of the government, to remove some of people's freedoms, I would not be worried about that, because we have active Ukrainian society that would never let that happen, right?
Yeah.
And on the other hand, of course, I believe that we should improve a bit the communication about those laws. Maybe they had to put more effort into properly developing the chapters of this bill, right? Speaking of our people, again, I'm really, really happy that people follow those decisions taken by our government, that they go on the streets to protest, even though at this very moment it's really, really dangerous. Actually, I was more worried about those people because, again, according to the law, we have to inform the law enforcement about the action, the protest, or whatever meeting that is taking place. And of course, when you give this information prior to this meeting, there's a big risk that Russians can use this information somehow in order to strike those people. So I was very much concerned about them. But I'm really, really happy that everything went fine. There were no ballistic missile strikes. And of course, I'm really, really happy that the protests actually brought some kind of results, because, again, the government heard what the people were saying. And we already have a statement made by the National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine and the Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecutor Office that they're grateful to the people that were supporting them, and they're also grateful to President and government who decided that new bill, better improved bill, must be developed and implemented. So at this very moment, we are expecting a plan that will be composed by all the chiefs of the law enforcement agencies that would offer some kind of roadmap, right? And based on this plan, after 2 weeks, we will most probably see a draft bill. And again, this is a really, really good example on how direct democracy works in Ukraine, because people usually dictate or direct our government. And I remember so many cases since 2014, right, when people were protesting against Ukrainian companies trading with occupied Crimea. When Ukrainian people were protesting again against Ukraine supplying Crimea with electricity, right? That was
Yeah.
occupied by Russian troops. And things like that. There are so many cases when people would just go on the streets and talk to people, talk to the government, and government would receive this message. So I think that we have this very, very
Yeah.
good case of society literally directing the government and
Well,
giving the necessary feedback
that's
to our
democracy.
politicians.
That's democracy in action, right? In the very definition of its word. And I think that Ukraine does have that. I find it super funny when I see people calling it a dictatorship, right? Because first of all, there are thousands of people across all major cities in Ukraine protesting, and I mean like in the thousands. There are cops at the protests to ensure safety. And also, I do want to say this. This was really funny yesterday because for the foreigners who are watching this, they probably don't know the geography of Kyiv, but it's near the near the theater of Ivan Franko, and it's the closest sort of like park point or the closest open space point to the office of the president, because obviously there is like the military and all of these fortifications at the office of the president, so we can protest in front of it, right? And you have to get there by turning from Khreshchatyk, Maidan, up to like the university. And there was so much traffic yesterday there that people were leaving their cars parked on Khreshchatyk, which is like borderline illegal because it's a 4-laner road on both sides. And I was one of those people, and none of the police officers were doing anything because people were just parked in like 3-4 rows because there was nowhere, you couldn't like turn up to the protest. And there was so much traffic, and there were lots of police there, but they were there to ensure safety, and they weren't like, apprehending the protesters or anything. There were many ambulances just in case as well. It was very, very much, I think the police is on the side of the people on this one as well. And yeah, I find it incredibly funny when people call Ukraine a dictatorship and Zelensky's office term as a regime, because again, there are tons of people protesting. And it's really hard not to hear our people because, to be fair, that protest was so loud. It is so loud. I think if I was at the office of the president, I wouldn't be able to go to sleep because it was so loud and it went. We were actually joking yesterday that this is probably the most happening place in Kyiv right now, because this is the only place where you can stay past curfew and not get arrested, because the optics of that on the internet would be really bad. So there were lots of people like protesting way past curfew as well. So it was a very
And I tell you this: the funniest thing that I've seen during these 2 days was literally Russian reaction to this, because when Russians talk, like even not just criticize Ukraine, but talk about democracy, or about fighting corruption, right? Or about things like protesting. That is extremely funny to hear coming from Russians, like how to properly fight corruption. That is insane. I have a question to you though.
yeah.
How do you think, why Russians, why we don't see much protests in Russia? Is it because Russians are afraid to go on the streets, or it's literally because they support Putin generally? I just want to understand myself.
I honestly think at this point, the people that are left in Russia don't really care enough to protest, right? Like in majority, like I'm sure that there are a couple of people or like some small percentage of people that don't support him, right? But in general, I think most of them, first of all, they don't care. They don't care to protest against like killings in Ukraine, because a lot of them, when we see this on Telegram, they cheer for it and they love it. The Russians that moved abroad, those that tried to protest in the beginning, I think it was a very small amount of the population as well, because if you think of Russia, it's 140 million people country, well, probably less now, provided how many people died. But it's 140 million people country. And like, I think the largest protest we saw against the war in Ukraine had 10,000 people on the streets altogether, cumulatively, in all of the days that happened. That's a very small, that's nothing. That's not even 1% of the population. That's terrible. Terrible optics, terrible turnout. So I don't think they care enough, and those that like did care, they're not willing to get hurt for freedom, which is the biggest difference between Ukrainians and Russians in terms of protesting, because we are willing to get hurt for freedom. When we were going to Maidan, and we saw that those students were being beaten, right? The people that went to Maidan went there with the understanding that they're gonna get hurt, and they were okay with getting hurt in order to not live under a regime. In Russia, they want to protest with a piece of paper peacefully. They want to protest a dictatorship, and they are like, oh, but they beat us. That's why we can't go there. But it's like, how did you expect to take down a regime? I also found it very funny. I think one of the funniest things that I've seen coming from Russia on Twitter this week related to the protests in Ukraine was someone saying that it cannot be real that these protests are allowed and no cops are interfering with it and like whatever. And the reason why it cannot be real is because how come does everybody have the same cardboard? Because normally when you go to protest, it's like different papers because people take like different textures and like whatever, because people take whatever is laying around at home. And I was like, sweetheart, we all have Novopochta boxes at home. Like the reason why it's the same cardboard is because we have a very efficient post office in this country, and literally every single person has cardboard from that post office at home. That's why it's all very similar, but it's like they're reaching so hard because at first they tried to say it was Zelensky's regime, then that it was protest against Zelensky, against the fighting, for the peace talks, right? None of that worked because people in Ukraine came onto social media and were like, no, listen, we're pissed, but okay, like, please stop using this to your advantage of your like weird talking points. So that didn't work. So it's like, how do we make this illegitimate? How do we make this look bad for Ukraine? Right? And it's like, this is a paid thing by Zelensky to make it look like it's a democracy and they can protest because their cardboards are the same. And I'm like, what? There is also they're also like, I don't know. Yeah, sorry. It's if you've ever been to a protest in Ukraine, someone brings like a ton of cardboard and they have markers and you come up to them and they either make the poster for you or you can make it yourself or you recycle other people's, but like people help each other. What a concept.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. Everybody knows Nova Poshta. Everybody has Nova Poshta's boxes at home. Like it's 100%. Yeah, the reason I asked you that question is just to show that compared to Russia,
Yeah.
I don't know. I think even Somalia has better democracy than Russia. Ukraine, of course. We have this very interesting culture that emerged in Ukraine, I believe, since the Orange Revolution, 2004, 2005. And this just kept going. Probably it's some of our national feature that we don't really recognize authorities in Ukraine, right? Though we're a democratic nation, but anarchy is deep in our blood because this is how we used to live throughout centuries. Village next to village next to village, solving our stuff.
Yeah.
And this is why we feel this very, very big responsibility in terms of controlling our authorities, especially after 2013, 2014, when we were repressed so much by those pro-Russian forces in Ukraine. And after that, we acquired something that we know as dignity, right? We had revolution of dignity. Because, for example, if you take Russia, people don't protest much because either they are afraid or they don't care. And also Russian authorities, they don't care much about those protests, right? Because they know if people gather somewhere in front of the establishment, they can just call Russian cops, crime enforcement agency, and they will just go and beat up protesters and arrest them and everything will be solved. They don't care, right? In Ukraine, it's absolutely different. Again, as someone who worked and had such cases, right, back in my days, I know that in case people gather on the streets and start protesting against a decision, whatever level this decision was made on, it's already a crisis, but not for the country, for this very establishment. I remember since my times of my service in the National Guard, it's a crisis for top managers, all right, for politicians, for decision makers. It's a crisis, and we can see that the result of this crisis was, for example, yesterday when that meeting was established with the chiefs of the law enforcement agencies and President Zelensky, where they tried to solve this situation, understand why this crisis emerged, why there are people on the streets, what are they talking about, what is the reason for their dissatisfaction, and what can they do to solve this, because this is exactly how it works in official Ukrainian establishments. People start running around like crazy, trying to understand, okay, what caused this? Who is responsible, of course, because somebody's going to get punished for that, for different reasons. Miscommunication, bad draft of this law, whatever. And then how can we solve this situation, of course? So I can see this happening, and I'm very much satisfied with that. Again, this shows this enormous gap between democracy in Ukraine and this absolutely disgusting culture of dictatorship and enabling this dictatorship in the terrorist federation, because them watching Ukrainians protesting, that's something they cannot even imagine, right? They look at the television, some people that were literally born and probably will die under, Putin's regime. They look at that and they don't really understand, like, how is it even possible? And of course it's wrong, right? People on the street is absolutely wrong according to Russian opinion, which I am so proud that our citizens feel this dignity inside of them to go on the streets. Again, I might be, repeating myself, but I was so much concerned about those missile strikes, because at this very moment, such things are extremely dangerous, but at the same time, extremely needed to make sure that we keep fighting against corruption, and we keep, following the roadmap that we decided for us, right?
To be fair, and this is, obviously not, this is not a fact, this is just more of perception based, but if you were to protest anywhere in Kyiv, near the office of the president is probably the safest place, considering how air defense is located. So at least there is that, and there are lots of underground shelters in that area and stuff. However, I'm looking back at how many people there were yesterday, and probably if there was an air raid and there was a ballistic missile, it would be very hard to disperse in in a fast amount of time. However, I do like that people are not just protesting and Zelensky comes back and says, okay, we're gonna change things, and people are like, oh, okay, let's go home. They're not. There's still going to be protests until we see it through and see that something does change. So I like that our democracy is not just protesting, it's also protesting and keeping a hand on the pulse until the actual change is presented and shown to you. Because people are jaded, people don't trust governments in general. And I think right now, because of the lack of the communication, there is very little trust for the government on this issue, so people are not going to be willing to let go. In fact, I'm actually bringing sandwiches and going to the protest with kombucha today, because yesterday we were standing there, and it gets very repetitive at some point, and you just kind of want to at least have something to eat or drink or something like that, because it's you're standing in this big crowd in the middle. I'm sure you have been to the theater Franca, and the layout there, but unless you're sitting there on the fountain and actually have a bird's eye view, it gets quite repetitive. But yeah, I also love how Ukrainians are taking all of the sort of pop culture references. I don't know if you are familiar with the concept of NABU. It's a Labubu with Zelensky's face. Okay. I thought it was very brilliant, because the amount of just ridiculous posters I saw, first of all, that don't push the horses, is absolutely everywhere. All of Zelensky's previous quotes of saying I'm not an idiot, as in from way back in 2018, I think, when he was elected. The Nabubu things were just absolutely my favorite. I honestly I'm going to send a picture of a poster my friend made to insert here, because I thought it was top notch. So I do love how we take trends and pop culture references and bring them to protests for actual social justice. I've also seen a bunch of people online that actually went on their first dates, and they went to the protest, and I was like, this is just, I'm so proud of our youth, you know, instead of going to like a restaurant, you're going to fight for social justice. That's amazing. And when I was there, it was a very interesting feeling because I think last time I was at like a major protest like that, it was Black Lives Matter. And before that, because I wasn't here during the Revolution of Dignity, it was during the Orange Revolution. So all of my friends were making fun of me because I was like, wow, this feels just like the Orange Revolution. And they're like, that's so long ago. Like there's so many other things that you could have experienced earlier. But yeah, it was an incredible thing, and I really do sure hope that our government gives the world sort of a blueprint on how democracy is supposed to look like based on their response and what they're gonna do in response to this public unrest.
I absolutely agree with you. I have some very, very dramatic, probably, memories related to the Franco Theater because during the times of the Revolution of Dignity, you know that the law enforcement, not sure how to call Berkut properly, they were located near the administration of president and near the Franco Theater. There were quite a few like observers from that side. There were titushkas. I remember that we fought titushkas there quite a few times. And fast scrolling 1 year forward to 2015, I remember that we were already policemen there in that very park, literally throwing snowballs at kids and back. We were like literally stationed there, and some school kids were like hanging out. So we had this snow fight. I have pictures of that. Yeah, the memories are dramatic and endearing at the same time. But currently, I'm sure that Ukrainian people will keep showing that we can be actually an example of democracy for other countries. One very important thing was that immediately after that bill was adopted, our partners, Germany, Netherlands, Sweden, and so on, they already expressed their opinion regarding this in the social media. And of course, this was also one of the elements why this reaction coming from our government was so immediate and so dramatic, probably. So they decided that they should act really, really fast in order to make sure that, yes, we keep this legacy of Revolution of Dignity, that the reforms keep going, that we are not going to change our roadmap, and that Ukrainian people will be able to control this process. I think that is extremely important to understand.
Yeah, I do think so. And I also want to add that, you know, when people, when these protests erupted, when this law was passed and people started talking about how Ukraine is so corrupt, how it's a hellhole, how like, why are we supporting Ukrainians, you know, I think that if you saw the reaction of the Ukrainian people to the passing of this law and decided that Ukraine is too corrupt to support, the problem is you, not the other way around, because you don't know how a democracy works. Because if anything, this is the biggest, brightest example of people taking matter into their own hands and not letting crappy laws be passed, not letting democratic backslides be passed, and keeping their government accountable. Because that's just, you know, that's how you do it. And I think that the government responding to the people and taking their thoughts and their comments into consideration is also a very big indication of a democracy, not the other way around.
Yeah, absolutely, because this is how it works in Ukraine, right? I mean, Ukrainians understand that they can solve all the problems by literally going on the streets, and they will be heard. Since 2014, it works, all right? It works in Ukraine, and when there's some kind of problem that that draws public attention to it and requires finding some kind of solution, it always works in Ukraine. I don't even remember many cases of those protests turning into, I don't know, some kind of mayhem or whatever. 99% cases, everything is peaceful. And again, 99% cases, our government or or establishments, they hear people speaking, which again makes me so much proud of
Yeah.
being a Ukrainian citizen.
Well, I also, someone asked me how are Ukrainians able to do these things? Because, for instance, in America, like corporate, right, like a lot of people can't go protest because they're working. And I actually thought about it, and this is such an interesting comparison, right? Because first of all, if you're a business owner, you're likely going to close earlier that day, and you're going to let your employees go to the protest because you support it. Like we have a very strong like civil camaraderie going on. That's one. Two, a lot of young people have their own businesses. Ukraine is like one of not many countries in Europe, or like I guess out of like the more developed countries, where you have an ability to make more money with your own business instead of working corporate and working for someone. So a lot of people work from home, a lot of people own their businesses, a lot of like young people in general, they work on their own schedule. So people can in fact close up shop and go to the protest. And it was a very interesting question to me because I never thought about it before. But this is also a very interesting aspect of the Ukrainian society where things are very different than what we're normally used to somewhere else in the world. Because maybe we don't have, Google headquarters and Apple headquarters and like Dyson headquarters and whatnot, but that actually makes the country less dependent on corporate businesses and corporate like ladder climbing, and gives people more freedom and more leeway to sort of to be responsible for their own time. So yeah, this is like a huge seg, but it was also very interesting. It was such a simple question, and it got me like into so many different rabbit holes of like, wait, how are we able to do all of this? But yeah, it was lovely. It was very good to see so many young people at these protests. It was very good to see how much conscious youth there is in this country. It was also great because I don't think I know a single person that did not go to these protests. So I was very proud of my circle of people that I know, because all of my Instagram stories yesterday were legitimately uninterruptedly people going to the protest. So it was like a very great thing to see. Well, I think that we've probably covered everything that there is to cover about this protest. So do you have any closing statements that you want to share?
I just want to briefly mention that, remember, during the Revolution of Dignity, there were so many people that could just stay on Maidan for days and weeks at a time, even though they had their work. I worked myself. I worked at the television, then I worked at the in the communications agency, and still I had absolute freedom to just go to the Revolution of Dignity, to the Maidan, and participate in it, because my bosses, my chiefs, knew that it was important, right?
Yeah.
That the fate of our country was decided at the Maidan of Independence, and we had no other option but just to
Yeah.
go. So they had no other option but just to let us go there. So I'm really, again, really happy that we have such understanding. And I would only really like to see the communication between the government and people a bit improved. And it's generally, it's not the problem specific to Ukraine. There's many similar cases. For example, Germany, there are such cases. Again, German government either giving Taurus missiles to Ukraine or not giving those missiles. Why? Well, nobody really knows. However, there is like a very easy explanation regarding those missiles as well. We can see similar cases in many other countries. So I think the biggest problem is, of course, miscommunication. And I have this hope that our colleagues, the communication specialists working for our governments, will spend some time, putting more effort into making this communication more transparent and explaining things better to people, because this is something very important, specifically in Ukraine. In Ukraine, we have this national feature called zrada that we all absolutely love and admire in Ukraine. To our viewers who don't know what it is, it's like literally the feeling
Betrayal.
of being betrayed by everyone. You don't
Yeah.
trust anyone, cops, governments. We have all that, and I've been on both sides of that. First as a protester, then as a policeman, and later as a military. I know what it means, but despite that, it's still something very, very needed because it makes Ukrainian people feel responsible for the decisions taken by their own government, by people they elected.
Yeah.
So, in my opinion, whatever is going to change will change for better.
Yeah. Well, I also want to add from myself to the concept of zrada, which is betrayal, right? It plays in very well. Ukrainian language has so many like beautiful ways of playing on words, right? Because Verkhovna Rada is like the High Council, which is the name of our parliament. Verkhovna Zrada is the concept of like the highest level of betrayal. So it's like an easy way to take words and make them have a very big meaning. Like there was actually the way that I want to close this episode today is one of the slogans that were chanted at the protest was "Vlada це народ," which I guess makes no sense in English because like the government is the people, right? But in Ukrainian, "Vlada" also means power. So it's the same word for both the government and power. And power is the people is a very good slogan to explain exactly how Ukrainians work and how we see ourselves in the realm of our government and how we see the government in the realm of us, because it's not like you are above us. It's like, no, we employ you. Like we put you there to make these decisions. We can take you out. So it's a very big, it's a very, I think that's a good closing statement for this one. So thank you.
Yeah, I agree on that.
Yeah, thank you for being here. Thank you for helping me dissect this and explain it to people. And as per usual, obviously, always good to chat with you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, of course. Well, I hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I did because, well, I always love talking to Starsky and I also love explaining Ukrainian political dynamics to foreigners. So if you enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to subscribe to this channel, turn on all of your notifications, like this video, send it to a friend, and of course, do tell me what you think in the comments below. Till next time.